So, you know, one of the things that we've been doing in these listening sessions and toward building a national strategy in these important areas of education, training, public access to information, public participation, public and cooperation on how to support climate actions across communities, is that we need to have justice, inclusion, and respect. So we're going to typify that to the best of my ability, even though I've botched a couple things already. So please, you know, let's be soft with each other in this lovely all teleworking space. So, you know, throughout this process and ultimately the implementation, we need to uphold justice, and we're going to explore that deeply. Inclusion, why that's important, and respect for all the values and shared experiences. So it says there why these are important. I think, you know, I really want to save time for the discussion. So you can see here that we're moving through this process, and we expect to have a version of a strategy sometime in the October to December timeframe. There's a lot of decision work that's going to be going on that's going to be crucial for what we bring to the table to be considered deeply. And I don't know of a community better than the one we are part of to be helping that process. So this is, you know, there's this international framework where all the countries are supposed to develop a national strategy related to education, training, and public access and public participation for supporting climate actions. It's under the United Nations Treaty. They have this guideline for how to do this on these dimensions. And, you know, check boxes are areas where our community, in a variety of ways, have already really advanced a lot of the key pieces. This network that we're part of, CLEAN, is definitely one of those elements, but it's not the only one. There's many other networks that are related to the space. So this is just to give you a grounding in what we're doing today. So there are a lot of really important parts of this effort that we've identified over the years, different audiences, different strategies. Clearly over the last 4 to 5 years, youth and workforce as it relates to education have shown up massively. But then there's other dimensions that have really shown up from where we were back in 2007, 8, 9. So with that in mind, the format of today is we're going to do introductions. And that's where we're in right now. We're wrapping that up very soon. We'll move into a panel discussion for about 40 minutes. And then we're going to hopefully have questions for 10 minutes. So far, we've not hit that 10-minute time frame. There's just too much richness in the panel discussions to really hit that mark. So I'll do my best to open it up. If you do have questions as people who are not panelists, please ask them in the chat. We will be downloading and reviewing those after the call if we don't get to them all, and Tamara Ledley will be facilitating that process. But know if you put a question or a comment or something to be considered, it will be reviewed and looked at and considered in this longer process just beyond today. So
just so that you know that where you say you can add your thoughts here, you need to put, you do need to put that link in the chat if you want people to access it.
I will do that. I'm wondering if Patrick, you have access to the slides. Would you mind putting that into the chat?
Sure.
Awesome. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Tamara, for that procedural point. Good catch. So I'm going to start the discussion just a minute early because we really have a lot to talk about and we have a lot to share. I took this picture from one of the Climb Time initiatives that is a funded initiative from the state of Washington on climate change education and professional development and NGSS, because they're an NGSS state. And so the first question, just to kind of get us started, is, you know, when you think about climate action, and then you think about K-12 teachers, why is it important to support K-12 teachers, and why is it key for supporting climate action? It's a loaded question, it's a leading question, but it's an important question. So any of the panelists, this is open. I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see as many of you as I can. What do you think? Why are K-12 teachers key for supporting climate action?
Frank, I started to think about this
And I think given the time period that we're in, we're seeing that teachers are really trusted. They're trusted voices in the community. And teachers bring a willingness to learn that I think is inspirational. In our work in the Climb Time Project, teachers have come in with inquisitive minds, open minds, and they're able to translate complex information that they're learning back to the classroom to share with their students. So I feel like there's a genuineness that comes through our teachers and their abilities then to make that information accessible to different groups of students whom they serve.
Wonderful. Does anybody want to
Those
build
are
on?
great points, Ellen. If I might just add a couple to them and we can just keep building on this list. I think one of the critical things is that teachers are able to help their students of any age become critical thinkers, which is essential in a COVID era. It's essential in climate science and misinformation in a world where science isn't always trusted these days. So critical thinking skills, regardless of the topic you're teaching, that's a critical skill that teachers impart to their students. And we know that research shows that students bring home the lessons and skills they learn in the classroom. So by impacting their students in this way, they can even be teaching those critical thinking skills to their families and practicing, modeling that behavior for their families. And the only other thing that's germane to our program specifically, and others that practice the same thing, is that teachers can expose their students to how to leverage real environmental data sets in the climate area and leverage that to inform actions and decision making, as opposed to what we see so often in society is that people make emotional decisions. And as scientists, we want data-driven information and decision making, and that's something teachers are well suited to impart to students of any age.
Gotcha. Others?
If I could add to that, this is something that I impart in the methods courses that I teach, is that there is this implicit superpower that many teachers have, and that is the ability to have multiple streams of thought going on at the same time. I mean, some of this is, Wendy, you captured a lot of it, but the idea is the teacher is thinking about what their kids are doing, what their kids are doing when they go home, what is going to be going on in class next week, really, trying to get some feedback to see which way things should adjust. And, when we look at, why are teachers key, most people do not think in these multiple streams of thought. And teachers do. Teachers have to.
Yeah.
And, so this is something, potentially to leverage, everything that's been said is true. And this is what they are thinking about, how they're thinking about them as these multiple pathways simultaneously.
So I'll build on what Eric said and what Wendy said is indeed there's an intersectional space. An intersectional space is where we as researchers and climate literacy, supporting climate literacy, we're there. But then there are the teachers who are also looking into their students' lives. And when they're looking into their students' lives, they can see that, okay, how do these climate literacy topics intersect with the other environmental issues, health issues, the socioeconomic issues that are part of these students' lives? So that intersectional space, none of us is so much into that space as the teachers are.
Right.
I can build up a little bit too, which is a short point. Teachers have, like DeVarty is saying, a unique perspective on students' lives and have a unique ability to create a safe and just space for sharing and storytelling and bringing in perspectives of students that are often limited in other spaces in their lives, where they're not given a chance to talk about feelings or emotions or ways of dealing with problems in their lives. And I think it's specifically around climate action and climate change solutions. We know that stories are very important for learning how to talk about complex issues to make changes. that are relevant and just to everybody. So I think when we think about teachers' roles in this climate change solutions, I think it's more about stopping that spiral of silence at a young age and showing that it is okay to talk about complex, politicized issues in a constructive way.
So I'll throw in on this too. I think of teachers as bridges, and I think, you know, different people have named that already in particular ways. So they're bridges to youth, they're bridges for youth to other places, they're bridges that youth are to their families and communities. And thinking about the way that teachers are sort of a nexus of control, like they're a center for designing learning environments. And that could go a lot of different ways. And so if we're thinking about climate action, we can work with teachers to support them in thinking about, like, what is climate action that is not necessarily political action in teachers directing this has to be the way it is, but that's scientifically informed climate action. And that has a lens. I really like many of the things that were said around the justice-centered work, so that we can actually, I mean, teachers are situated in their community. They are part of a community. They're in relation to their students and those families. And because of that, they can find those local phenomena. They can find those local connections. So they're bridges in knowledge bases too, from scientists who think more abstractly and holistically in the world, down into practice to like engagement and motivation of how to do something locally. So I think all of those aspects make teachers really central, and as a result, make educational efforts really central in this work.
The tapestry of answers that just was created is a rich and wonderful one. But, you know, I think one of the dimensions that whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. There we go. Is it feels aspirational, some of that, right? Because, I mean, I think what we see is examples of what you've described across the country. But in order for that to be more common to the life of every student, because remember, there are 54 million plus students at the K-12 level. 1 in 4 people in the country is basically a student. That's a crazy large segment of the country. So that's why I really wanted to zoom in on this question. But, you know, how can K-12 teacher professional development on climate change, education, engagement, empowerment, better support the development of an inclusive and equitable climate solutions in communities? Now, that's the reason I read that is because I'm running a protocol. So these are the same questions with slight variations. So it's a little bit wonky of a question because it's a protocol question. But that said, I think the how, because you are all leaders in one form or another in the space, and I'm looking at the other people who are not on the panel, and they are also people who are working in the space. So I'm very respectful of the wider perspectives that are going to be in the chat window, and I appreciate that. But the how, especially when you've got millions and millions of teachers, and we're not talking only science teachers here. So how can we do this?
I'll start from a theoretical perspective here. So at least in science education, we talk about a margin space and a center space, students at the margin and students at the center. There's always students at the margin and students at the center. Usually when we organically design a PD, we consider what are central students and what our dominant culture is. So in one of the few projects that I've been lucky to, or I can just say blessed to be a part of, that they have been designed either through the funders or through the district or the grant efforts, that they were designed from keeping in mind the margin and then moving towards the center. So what I mean to say is, for example, the Cycles project, which was in 2010, it was a NASA grant, but the grant funder itself had designed the program that we are going to do climate literacy, but it has to be from a culturally relevant perspective. So no matter what the team was, what the constitution of the team or where we came from, we were It was written in the proposal that we were to go out and first learn what the marginalized community was, what their way of learning was, and then to bring that into what the dominant culture is. So reversing that equation, I think, should be on the forefront if you were to think about making it more equitable.
Love that answer. Others have more to build on that?
I'm gonna throw a thought into there, and I'm sure Ellen like shares this and can add on to it for me. But in '98, there were 2 papers about Science for All, one by Angie Barton and one by O'Keefe and Company. So, and they framed Science for All in a really different way. And one of the things that we've been thinking about inside the Climb Time Initiative, and trying to just complicate in ourselves and our own biases as organizers and you know, change agents in the system, is what is it to shift the power dynamic in a way that, first of all, that we try and like make it more so that power is peer-to-peer power for different people that have been historically marginalized in the system. And that gets to this equitable climate solution. So how do we invite people into this space in a way that isn't asking them to be us, it's asking them to be themselves and share with us in this space and expand our minds, kind of blow our minds half the time, and like think about how we can create new and important adjustments in what climate solutions look like, in what climate education solutions look like. And so I think that is a tension that I have that is more on the Barton side of the equation, of like thinking about how Science for All can make all bigger and better and different than we're used to, but more exciting and innovative. And so trying to think about that. And I know Ellen's like my mentor. I like reach out to her. So I know she has thoughts on that too.
You're so funny. I think you're my mentor. Going back to Devarti's original and then her thought, and then building on Deb, this idea of students being on the margin and then students moving to the center. A lot of times our teachers have been on the margin as well. So, and we know that in science, sometimes we haven't often invited people in a positive way. But in K-12, you know, in the practitioner from the, you know, field perspective, we know where the margins are, right? We know that. So one of the things that we've learned in Climb Time is this ability to place base, to design the PD around the place. Instead of designing the PD for the topic, it's PD for the place, and including putting a strong emphasis on the relevance to the community. I love to use the example of going out to the coast and driving forever and ever and ever down to this tiny little community, and 100 and some odd teachers showed up for the day to study sea level rise and to engage in some really complicated work. And somebody who lived in the community said at the end of the day, I know this is going to sound really bad, but maybe we have to rethink some of our agricultural practices. And so it was like, boom. So I'll stop so that others, I'm really curious about other thoughts.
Sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt for a second. Frank, you did not share your slides, and so we don't have the link to that document. If you want to gather input from this conversation, you're going to need to forward your slides or the link or to somebody, or put the link in yourself to the chat.
I will do that at the toward the end when we wrap up, so that I'll send it out as the announcement to the Clean Network, because I'm not going to jam this topic.
Okay.
Patrick does have the slides.
I don't, but no worries. We'll get it.
Yeah, no, we don't have the slides, Frank. We didn't get them this week. Sorry about that.
They're in the old slides too. Any of these slides have this. Actually, never mind. We'll take care of it afterward. I don't want to rush us here. So that's the best way we're going to do it.
Just because there's a break in the flow of the great, really thoughtful answers to this tough question, I wanted to add something that's sort of a meta level point that I had about this, which I think that our group, as we think about this, tends to be on the leading edge of the curve of caring about supporting the development of inclusive and equitable solutions. But I think there's a more base level need to continue to even help educators discover that this is a concern. I don't think that every K-12 teacher in the country goes to work thinking yet, how can I be inclusive and equitable about any topic, let alone climate change? So I think we need to remember there's still work at that level.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go ahead, Lindsay. I just want to add a little bit after you're done. Wendy reminded me of something.
Yeah. I was waiting for this natural transition to move from maybe student-focused professional development to teacher-focused professional development, and providing spaces for teachers not only to learn about pedagogical tips or how to teach their students, but also how to move their own mental concepts of climate change or of equity or engagement. All of these words that we have in this slide are up for grabs. Everyone defines engagement differently. Everyone defines empowerment differently, and teachers bring those different definitions to their classrooms, and they are then acted out in different ways. And I think providing time, especially this is what we do in our professional development, is to bring stories from different audiences to teachers so they can see into the lives of other people themselves, and not only tell them to do that for their students, but do it for them as well. And so bring voices of marginalized folks, bring voices of the youth action teams to them. And that can naturally cause them to question their own beliefs, like it would anyone when you hear someone else's story. I think focusing equally as much on their personal development as well as their students is important.
Gotcha.
I'd hazard that most teachers aren't necessarily thinking of climate science and equity in the same sentence. And it's only when you're getting at these things from that local level, that local engagement, what's going on in your neighborhood that can be directly related to, what's personal to you, and how does that become an issue of equity, and how the hazards associated with climate change are not equitably distributed as well. So it's when you get to that local level, that's where the teachers can make that connection.
I wanted to add that NSTA, the website itself, has been a great source for me to understand diversity and inclusions, because they provide case studies, and in those case studies there are vignettes and stories and narratives, and how you can apply those stories and narratives to the work you're doing, whether it be professional development or classroom teaching. So there is an example that's already out there for capturing this rich narrative, and it can be done again in context of climate literacy.
That you say that, DeVarty, because we actually just this spring have shifted the way that we're communicating because of many of the asks of this community and others inside the state and out. And one of the things that we did this year is we collected what we're calling portraits of a project. And we asked all of our sub-project folks in the state to basically tell a story, like tell us a story about the work you're doing, and like give us some detail and show us with evidence like how you know what you know about this learning or this activity that you're doing. And we're working on polishing those and like creating little sort of vignettes from each of these different projects and some across the project to be able to try and give concrete examples for folks of what our work has looked like and why we've taken the stance we've taken in any particular decision pathway that we've had to do on a project. Because that's like many of the things folks are saying are very true. Like as we decide what we're going to do, and as teachers decide in any moment what they're going to do, the rationale is we need to make it transparent for them, because that's that metacognitive moment that teachers have in their own learning that they need to be able to share with each other. And as teacher educators, we need that too, to be able to share that with each other. But there's a certain vulnerability in doing that, right? And so trying to figure out how to do that in a way that respects the work and respects people's risk taking, but also shares the work with each other. Eric, just one thing to the point that you made. I actually think that it's a really interesting time we're in right now, and that we actually don't have good data on what is the central concern that teachers have around equity and climate, and how much overlap there is in that work. I was shocked in 2016 after the election. I was in Portland, Oregon for the regional NSTA conference, and Ellen, were you there too in that one? Oh, it was so interesting. And I had a session myself that was about race and biology classrooms and eugenics, and another colleague of mine had a session on sort of race and environmental health, and they were packed, like people out the door. And we had never seen that before. And it was a really interesting shift that I noticed, where science teachers are now starting to feel responsibility around developing critical thinking skills as it relates to both equity and the environment, more so than I've ever seen before. And so I think it would be a really interesting study if somebody could work out how to sample all that, to figure out how many teachers at different grade bands are actually deeply concerned and like looking and seeking support in this area.
Absolutely. Are we able to? Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate that. So let's. I think there's a natural segue to this next question, because I think, you know, Eric, I'm hearing your question, and I'm also I love that idea, Deb, about that study, but you know, this idea of better engage, right? How can we better engage the diversity of local leaders and partners through professional development programs for the millions of teachers across this thousands of districts? And I think, you know, Ellen, your point before about really drawing this down into the community context, not the topical context, is a really important insight that I think I want to carry through this as well. But man, I've not seen us do this yet. Now, this feels very different. We've got elements of it, but you know, I'd love to hear what your insights are on how can we better do this. It's a new recipe that we're trying to do at a much bigger scale. You know, what do you think?
Ellen, can you say something about the Science Fellows? Because that was a critical aspect to the Washington State system.
So in Washington, we have an unsupported, so this is not funded through the state. These are self-funded teachers through their schools and districts. I'm saying that straight out. We have a network of about 300 science fellows, what we call science fellows teachers, who come together to learn, I guess, more about how to be an educational leader in their communities. So we have a common, this is a statewide project, it's common. What happens on one side of the state is a similar experience to what will happen on another side of the state. And then once a year, we bring all of these teachers together and we have a shared experience. So you notice I didn't use the word training. It's more about a shared experience, a shared learning experience, adult learners. And then from there, they translate that into ways to bring that information back and distribute the information across their school systems. So they apply to be a fellow, and then it's a 3-year commitment. And when they are finished their 3 years, they become what we call a Emeriti. And so as a Emeriti, then they take on leadership activities of their own choosing. And so in that, I think Deb is wanting me to share that that's one of the ways that we've built capacity informally across the state through kind of more of that grassroots, Frank, that you were asking about.
Right.
I also feel like one thing that needs to be said here is the competitive model that we've used forever in our country is not working for us in this particular space. The space needs to be collaborative. And that is not, I don't say that easily. Trust me, Deb knows, for 2 years, we've been working on a collaborative model, trying to break down the competitive model, just so that we can have better engagement and a diversity of folks participating.
That's so key. That is one of the central findings out of our casework in the Climb Time study, or the Climb Time effort, is that collaborations of all types are critical to the way in which we're actually starting to get more sustainable relationship building and activity in the space. So collaborations between educational service districts who never really worked together tightly in the same way. They had network, but they didn't work together in a collaborative way. They're now co-presenting. Yesterday, a couple of them co-presented together and a whole course. And then we also have collaborations between educational service districts, so more formal K-12 structures and community-based organizations, between community-based organizations in interesting and new ways, with tribal communities and community-based organizations and other government entities. It's really interesting. And I think that can only grow, to think about like business and community leaders, you know, career and technical folks, like those are all important connections. And that's not to sprinkle through all of that are scientists in different institutions and positions that are also deeply engaged in all that work.
But I'm also hearing the teacher leader function, and I've very much valued and appreciated that. And I think it's a critical, I'm hearing you. But then there's also the teacher practitioner side. And there's an efficiency in teacher leadership model, but then there's the larger teacher practitioner models and how to support them. That's another scale of activity, let alone. I mean, Wendy, your model at AMS, and Jim, I appreciate you as well. That's another model. Wendy, do you think that you're working more on the leader or the practitioner or both?
We're working on both.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
And we have work to do on working on both, always.
I think I think it's an ongoing process, and I totally agree with Wendy. It will be very hard to parse out these two. But then the important role that plays in this process is the district. And if for an organization like AMS, for Wendy, district collaborations, do they come easier to you, Wendy? This is a question I ask you, because to us, we have to go through the backward design process, which means we first establish the relationship with the district, see the needs of the teachers, and then write the grant or develop the project around that need, so that there are benefits to both parties, and we set up that way. But does that come easier to you?
No, I mean, nothing about that connection to the local district or even state level is easy for us. I think what we have on our side is our longstanding reputation. So it's word of mouth between teachers that bring additional participants. And additionally, our national mentor network for the data stream, many of them are early participants and not only local leaders, but state leaders. And so their reach at the state level can make a powerful difference in the attractiveness of what we're talking about to a teacher that may not know of us. But it's incredibly difficult to make those local connections.
Yeah, so sustainability and time is on your side, and possibly the small scale programs like ours leverage access to some funds and some access to cohesive efforts with district. That's what we do best in, but sustainability of that effort are developing our teacher leaders beyond the 3 or 4 years of our grant. We don't do that. So, but that is something I would advocate.
Maybe I can just invite Jim, who was in this role longer and also has been very active at the state level and is one of our distributed teacher leaders now and has been before, just to clarify anything I said or fix it if I said it incorrectly, Jim.
Oh, I think you did a great job, Wendy. I think the idea that you have local leaders distributed was something we strongly started out with. And so our programs have succeeded mainly because we had those teacher leaders. They've been called different things at different times. So you might have heard the word ERA And those teacher leaders have been with us for a very, very long time, and they have a lot of credibility. They understand what teachers face, and sometimes that is a very local issue, but sometimes it's a very common issue among teachers throughout the country. And we've had this strong leadership that is able to communicate with teachers that are in the classroom, and that has been, I think, really the key. And we work hard to develop additional teacher leaders along the way, and there's still an awful lot to learn how to get people invested in it and connected to it. But I think we build upon what we've already built, and largely it's a good success story. Teachers also are looking for the content. They want the climate information, and that is what brings an awful lot of them to us.
Gotcha. Thank you, Jim. Lindsay or Eric, do you have something else to build on this? No? Lindsay? So one thing I do want to note for the record is that there's an interesting thing of the local work and then AMS, and I think Climate Generation, you also do this as well, as the bridging structures between those efforts and those local communities and those leaders. It's not just, I see Deb, you got, there's two things going on at least, if not more. So I wanted to name those. Deb?
Lindsay, you want to jump in?
I don't have much to say besides I feel like there's a lot of moving components and there's no schematic of this. And I would really benefit from a schematic where we can say, in this context, these are the key players. In this context, these are the key players. And then it provides some grounding for us to actually critically think about how this should look or what's good and bad about it. Everything, I relate to everything that people are saying, and also think in our context, it looks different. So acknowledging that even all of our strategies are inherently different for dealing with this, I think it'd be useful if we want to move forward as a group and as a team and in using the best innovative tools that we have. I think we need some sort of framework for thinking about this. That's really good.
Yeah, Lindsay, there's two things that sort of sparked my thought about that. Whenever we're thinking about systems change, we need to think about a few things. One is we need to know who's in the system. We need the boundaries of the system, and we need the actors in the system. So we need to do some kind of like mapping of who we're trying to influence and why, toward what vision, hopefully. And then we need to kind of either collaboratively design that vision together, if that's how we're doing it, or we need to impose a vision, if that's how we're doing it. And there are pros and cons to both, versions. And so that's, it's funny because I realize, Ellen, like there's a much deeper backstory to our collaboration, is that the Washington State Climb Time work is sitting inside years of work that the Institute of Science and Math Education has done with the Council of State Science Supervisors and in Washington State around the building of the STEM teaching tool collection and other types of resource moves that were there for what you're naming, Lindsay, of like, and Frank, like that resourcing of these teachers, the needs as they pop up in practice. So not just as a researcher writing papers about things, but as a practitioner trying to find something in practitioner language that works for folks and solves some challenge that they name and are facing, and resolve that. And I think, series, the clean work has really been a lot of that too. And so those types of resourcing moves help build communities that are working and thinking around that. And that helps like expand who we're working towards. But part of that is knowing who those people are and who the actors are to help collaborate with and build with.
And Deb, I don't think we need to know, on that note, the specific names of these organizations, but we need to know what role they fill within the system, and then use those general terms. So like science content expert or action organizer, those, once we can generally identify the roles within the system, then that framework can be translated to anywhere and we can bring anyone in and generally use that to guide them.
I think this is a beautiful segue to this next question, because that's really what this question was about, is it's clearly an ecosystem of activities. it's not just one thing, it's a group of things, and it's a group of actors working on those group of things. And I think that it is fair to say that it's an uneven landscape. Some places it's rich, and some places there's more whole than cheese. Sorry, I don't know why I'm using Swiss cheese analogies as much as I am recently, but there it is. But you know, I think, and I actually want to ask Eric, if you don't mind, you know, because you're the one of the group of the panel that's working on pre-service teachers, as well as other activities in the space. You know, are there unique needs in the pre-service sector of this space that are different for you and your work? I don't know. I definitely wanted to capture some of the pre-service dimensions of this work. Maybe this is not the right place to come in, but do you have anything that is, because that feels like you guys are doing some of this work in your pre-service work.
Well, yeah, I mean, on a couple of different levels, and perhaps it relates back to some of the previous questions, but I know this was a joint NSTA, ASTE effort to revise preparation standards. And initially it was done around a model that had to be compliant with CAPE, or Council for the Accreditation of Educational Practitioners, or whatever CAPE stands for. Well, since that time, NSTA has broken with CAPE, and it's not quite cast adrift, but some of these issues that had come up with the previous slides of equity and social justice that were not present in previous iterations are now, you know, we're trying to make sure that those are present in terms of how teachers are to be prepared. But one of the more complex issues is the sense that you've got so many different models about how places are meeting particular standards, whether the state standards or some external source. And, you know, the idea is you've got not just people that are teacher educators or science teacher educators in a college of education, but you've also got content people that have no formal training in teacher education or teacher preparation that are teaching future teachers. And whether they're specialized classes or they are part of some large general class, it creates all sorts of complexities. You know, so part of all the discussion about how are we engaging teachers also applies to how we're engaging teacher educators. You know, so it's another layer of the onion, so to speak, going from cheese to onions, you know. But it's another layer of the onion, but it at the end of the day, there is no single solution. It truly is a complex system, and in that sense, we can kind of nudge the system one way or another, but we should be looking for general patterns rather than specific outcomes. So your last slide about the all the teachers and all the school divisions, and that is, as you say, quite aspirational, is the pattern that we're creating moving in that direction, not how many have we actually captured.
Right.
I think that's the more important part. But again, the complexities of how teachers are actually prepared is very, very messy. But you know, there was a NRC document that came out a couple of years ago on science teachers professional continuum. And one of the public meetings I was at, this district level gentleman summed it up so very nicely when he talked about, we have a school system. Okay, we keep using system of education, system of preparation. And, you know, that's where this idea of deterministic outcomes just, you know, popped into my head, that we're barking up the wrong tree maybe. So how are we influencing this sort of constellation? Everything that you have listed in this slide that you're showing now, all of these groups are people that we should be engaging as teachers, and as teacher educators, we should be bringing these into our classroom. So for example, you're speaking to my capstone class on the Climate Resilience Toolkit is fundamentally a part of something that we should be doing. That was a mixed bag of students in that class that you never got to meet. but you know, so some of them were going to become teachers, some of them are going to become nurses, some of them are across the board, but the idea is it captures all these stakeholders. I'm rambling on now, so I'm going to stop talking. So
Thank you, Eric, for that perspective.
Frank,
I'm feeling, Ellen, that you were going to want to say something.
well, being in the state agency, that you know that and having been blessed with a policy, I say there has to be state will. So I'm not going to speak to federal. I'll let you do that. But there needs to be state will, and within state will, there needs to be favorable policy. And I believe in our state, part of the success of our project, if I can say we have success, is that the work of the friendly policy came to the learning and teaching program in the state agency. So we were able to tap our networks. Teaching and learning and programs in state agencies are not heavily funded, right? So everybody knows that. So we have learned to live and work very frugally and very quickly. So I go back to the idea of friendly policy, government will, collaboration, not competition, bring in the younger educators. You know, there has to be a concerted effort to be really inclusive in who gets to participate, and then build in this idea of integration of ideas so that it's not just sitting in the science world. You want to bring in integration of ideas, and then you need evidence. So if you want to continue across time, you have to have evidence of impact, because I'm telling you, I never thought that I would be forward facing towards learning and teaching, and side would take facing towards policy makers and having to prove to them in under 2 minutes what the evidence of impact is.
Mm-hmm. Talk about a communication challenge.
Yeah, that too.
Do others want to add to this question? I believe there's one more. All right. So funding. Ellen, you alluded to this, but of all the work across all the conversations that we've had in our community and beyond, this always shows up as a critical issue, always. But you know, how should increased funds be prioritized? And this is a really important question. We had a task force on climate education and resilience in New York City, and we were talking about how to educate all 92,000 teachers in that school district, all teachers, not just science teachers, 92,000, one district with 1 million students. And how would you develop them related to this work? And you could easily chew up $1 billion without any trouble. And there's no way you're ever going to get that money, and nor would you ever want to spend all of it on one piece of one part of one thing. So, man, this is a critical question. If it's important, how you use it and how you explore it is a central tenet to this question. So, this is longer than the 7 minutes we have, and we've blown our question and answer time. I'm sorry again. This is not the only time we're going to talk about this as a community. We're going to have to continue moving this agenda forward if we're really going to make progress. This is just an opening, but any first line thoughts? Deb, I saw your hands, but
yeah, this is fundamental to me and like how we think about the system. So I would like us to really like think big and not think about the system as like, I only do this little piece, so I can't do that little piece. But like, how do we engage teachers in community-based learning that is climate action while they're learning? How do we engage students in, learning that's situated in career and technical development? How do we, so really thinking about how we integrate and overlap and maybe even shockingly change the structure of schools so that they are more situated in place in community or communities pulled in different ways. I was talking with Kathleen Kelly from the Center of American Progress, who was one of the authors on the Just Climate platform. And that was one of the things that we got talking about is how do we actually accelerate climate action by making all educational spaces also climate action spaces. And so I would just throw that into the pot.
Gotcha.
I'm going to add on to what Deb said. They're thinking big and then thinking about both in terms of private sector funding and public sector funding at the same time.
Okay.
And not, what I'm trying to say is there are, when you write a grant, I think of tasks as action items. So when you write a grant, the most successfully written narratives that I have read are those that show the diversity and that show the strength of many people coming together. So yeah, you could put an attempt together to go for big pots of money, but also acknowledging the little pots of money that can serve the small regional task items. Because, and in every attempt, even if it's a small grant, there was a very small pot of money that I had gotten when I was a doctoral student. It was $5,000, but it had taken me so far as to the impact it had made on me, the teachers, the students, just because it came at the right time for the right school. And it was a very good around, feel good for every one of us. So not ignoring those small pots of money. Now, the counter argument I hear in this one is that it takes me the same amount of time to put out an application for that small fund. Why should I not go for the big money? Well, to me, I have always found that the smaller pots of money let me make more impact on a very small regional scale. And that could be the foundation of the big pot of the money. So I feel that regional work has to be more, and then we can go towards the national, or we could divide and conquer, that some people are writing on the national scale and the regional ones are feeding the information to them.
I think that issue of scalability is important here when thinking about this, but I also think taking a step back, and I also think about it from a very practical way of who's going to be writing these grants. And one thing that we're not really talking about here is everyone's giving examples of how they write grants and how they've been successful in the past, but maybe not thinking about like how we as a new group will be successful. And one, I can think about grants for the background systematic things that we need to do, like organizing or providing venues for like facilitating collaborative events, things like that. But then also the regional programmatic areas or professional development trainings that we need to create. So one, I think we need to identify what type of funding we're talking about and what area of this organization and what is this organization. But then once we move past that, I think I agree with Devarty that mixed groups, coalitions of people applying for money are the ones that are typically the most successful in my mind. But I think it could be our role is to connect those people and to say, hey, teacher, NGO, and admin, you have a great opportunity in your area. I'll help you apply for it for your region. That could be our role as more of like a facilitator of making network connections and providing opportunities to let people then apply for regional grants. And we focus on the bigger organizational funding opportunities.
Right.
That's just me.
So we're close to the end of time. We could have gone, there's so much more to explore here. This is going to have to keep on going somewhere else, some other time. And there are so many other voices that I stopped looking at that little blinking chat thing up there. I have two screens. And so I've got a rich thing to explore and next, which is the chat. I really appreciate you guys' time. If there was something that you wanted to name that was not explored here today, can you name it? And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to remind everyone that a lot of the threads about the strategic work we're doing are going to be carried through this listserv. This listserv activity is going to go up in the next coming weeks. So you may want to join this. But I just want to, personally, while you're thinking, thank you all for your insights, your work, your passion, and your commitment to supporting teachers. As a former teacher myself, I know the power. I benefited greatly from the AMS program, supported me. I know what it takes to be supported in transformational learning as a teacher, and I'm indebted, and I'd like to return that favor back. So that's part of why I'm committed to this conversation. So if there's something else we didn't name, I know we're at time, but name it, please.
We named it. I think Wendy touched on it earlier, but I think it's a component that needs to be completely opened up in a different conversation. Is how are we dealing with the reflective practice necessary for folks to really understand equity and justice inside this climate action work, and what that means in any local level as we unpack it, because that's not easy work, and it's easy to be reproductive of oppression systems. So how do we get at that inside the work?
I also reflect back on a conversation, Deb, you and I had this morning about some other event, is why is diversity and inclusion such a critical piece? This is a different question, but why is it such a critical piece to making progress through education, community engagement, and training on climate action? Why is equity and inclusion critical to that effort? Because we're adding all these recipes and defining the system in rich ways. So that is a thread that is maybe another panel conversation.
And I think you used the key word this morning in that conversation was about how we're not just trying to find just climate solutions, but we're trying to find just climate solutions that are sustainable. Yes. And so trying to think about that aspect of long-term sustainable solutions really require equity and justice to be central.
Yep. So we're 2 minutes over. I blew my target. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Sometimes you got to add a little bit just because it's important to get that last bit in. I really appreciate everyone. Patrick, please do not close for a couple minutes because I need to get to the chat, and then I will let you guys go. Thank you very much. Please stop the recording, and I really appreciate everyone's contributions today. It was a rich conversation.
Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Nice to meet some of you.
Thanks, everybody.
Ellen, this is a wonderful crew, and there's so many more beyond here. So you're in great company, but I also want to thank your leadership for out of Washington State. You've done wonderful work, and I'm glad that it's moving beyond.